I'm going to rather unashamedly stray away from the original brief that was given to me and speak to you about some of the possible implications of the global financial crisis on international migration generally and on migration in the UK specifically. I'm doing this for two reasons. Firstly, this panel has clearly been overshadowed by events. When we were planning this panel, the global credit crisis, financial crisis, didn't really exist. It seems to me very important that we address that issue now. It's a key issue. I think it overshadows all discussion about migration and labour markets, so it's important that we insert it into our debate. And the second reason I'm keen to do this is that, rather like Philippe, I tend to think that discussion about immigration in the UK often tends to forget the bigger picture. And I think sometimes it's important to put our concerns about immigration in the UK into a wider global context. And I think by focusing on this topic, I hope to try to do that. You've read a lot about it, and I can't possibly summarise it in just one slide, but here, I suppose, are some of the headlines of the global financial crisis we're currently suffering as a globe. We know at an institutional level there's been a collapse of major financial institutions, something like £1.8 trillion reported to have been lost in the credit crisis, massive government bailouts in Europe and in North America too. Not just at the institutional level, but also implications for individuals. Individuals in richer countries suffering from the effects of negative equity, suffering from higher costs of borrowing, and suffering from rising unemployment. And I suspect unemployment will be an issue that we come back to during discussion. Also signals that the global financial crisis is beginning to impact on individuals in the poor world too. The financial crisis is compounding rising food prices and rising fuel costs that have a great impact on people trying to survive in poor countries. There's great price volatility around commodities. Many more poor countries rely on commodities as an export industry, and if the prices aren't stable, there's a great vulnerability for many of those countries and their export industry. Very serious indications for the United Nations that there will be reductions in aid over the next 12 months because countries are running out of money and running out of generosity and more concerned about keeping their money for other things. And decreasing investment by foreign countries, especially rich countries, in poor countries, and increasing pressures from banks in the rich world for poor countries to start to pay off their debts. So it's an institutional crisis, it's an individual crisis in the rich world, and also increasingly an individual crisis in the poor world too. Against that backdrop, that backcloth, let's just lay a picture of contemporary international migration. There are something like 200 million international migrants in the world today. As a generalisation, these are people who are moving because of growing global disparities. You often hear about the 3D explanation of international migration. People move because of disparities in development, they move because of disparities in democracy, and they move because of disparities in demography too. Now, that 200 million is a startling figure. People will tell you, and they'll be right to tell you, that is the equivalent of the population of the fifth biggest country in the world, Brazil. That's a very significant number of people. Equally, people will tell you, and they're equally right, that it's still only 3% of the world's population. The vast majority of the world's population never move, and if they do, they move internally. And I think especially around migration, and I think we have to be aware of this during our debate, statistics can be used to inform and statistics can be used to alarm. And we need to be careful about how we use statistics in this area. One of the most striking things about international migration today is the great scale of money sent home by migrants, remittances. It's estimated that something like $300 billion a year is sent home by migrants around the world. And that's a truly incredible sum. It's the number one source of revenue for many poor countries. It outstrips by far overseas investment and overseas aid, and it outstrips earnings from export industries in most third world countries too. And you won't be surprised to hear that in many countries in the world there are households that are completely and utterly dependent on remittances. And if, as I suggest might be the case, remittances start to decrease as a result of the global financial crisis, it won't just be the migrants affected, it won't just be the host economies affected, it'll also be poor people in countries relying on those remittances who will also be affected too. A couple more striking points about international migration. There may be as many as 40 million so-called irregular or illegal migrants around the world. Again, that's a very significant number. The only thing I'd like to focus on and stress for you is that there are many ways that migrants can enter an irregular status. It's not just about crossing borders without authorization. Perhaps the most common way to become an irregular migrant is to enter legally, and then when your visa expires, you stay on illegally. So it's not just about people being smuggled in the backs of buses and so on and so forth. People who are smuggled and trafficked are also victims of irregular migration. It's a larger concept than I think is often thought about. And my final background point on international migration, just to stress that the vast majority of migrants work, and they work across the entire spectrum, the entire range of the labour market, from the very highly skilled to the so-called 3D workers, another set of 3Ds in migration, people who work in dangerous, difficult and dirty jobs. And I think it's very important to recognise there's a spectrum of migrant workers, and they work across that range. Now, the challenge for policymakers and analysts at the moment is to work out how that first slide on the global financial crisis is impacting on this second slide on international migration. And I think there's great concerns to understand how the first will feed into the second and affect current patterns and processes of migration. We can perhaps discern some of the answers to that question by looking back in history. We know that there was a very significant financial crisis in Asia in 1997, and we can look at how that affected migration. Let me immediately say that there are difficulties in comparing the Asian financial crisis with the current global financial crisis. The Asian crisis was regional, firstly, and secondly, it was got over with fairly quickly. It finished fairly quickly. There are all indications at the moment that the global financial crisis today will tip the world into a quite long recession. So I have caution about the comparison, but nevertheless, there may be some indications that are worth looking at. A few headlines on the impacts of the Asian financial crisis on international migration. Firstly, fitting for this venue and for this audience, significant geographical variation. In Asia, some labour markets were basically untouched and unaffected by the financial crisis, particularly in Taiwan and Singapore. Other labour markets clearly slumped, especially in Korea and Thailand. So even though this was a regional crisis, different countries fared differently within the configuration of events. Secondly, very significant sectorial variations. Some sectors suffered much more than other sectors. In particular, in Asia, it was tourism and consumption-related industries that suffered, whereas the very high end of the labour market, highly skilled, and the very low end of the labour market maintained a robustness that I think was quite striking. And the reason, of course, is that you can't do away with high skills. You need them whatever the financial situation. And you can often not do away with very low skills. Migrant workers often undercut wages. They offer a form of cheap labour, and that's what you focus on when you're trying to buy your way and produce your way out of a recession. Where people were laid off during the Asian financial crisis, it was mainly local workers, not migrant workers, who were laid off. And again, the reason is reduced wages. Migrant workers, especially in Asia, tended to be willing to work for lower wages than the locals, and so locals suffered more than migrant workers in that particular context. I think the headline, looking at the effect of the Asian financial crisis on migration, was that it may have exacerbated existing trends, but it certainly didn't transform anything. The effect was short-term, it accelerated certain processes, but then it settled down to pretty much as it had been before. And I think the final observation to make is that in many ways the Asians had the foresight to see migration as a solution to the financial crisis. There were no mass programs of regularisation, there were no mass programs of deporting people, there were no great efforts to really try to address migration as being part of the obstacle, part of the problem. What the Asians did was use migrant labour to lower cost of production, to increase competitiveness, and to try to produce their way out of the crisis. And to an extent, that worked in the Asian context. There's less information, but we might also discern some hints of an answer to this question by looking at the Russian financial crisis a year later after the Asian crisis in 1998. 18% increase in emigration from Russia during the crisis. A great pressure on people to leave. In particular, emigration was dominated by the youth and by professionals. There was something of a brain drain out of Russia in response to the financial crisis. At the same time, a significant reduction in migration to Russia. One thing to say about Russia, and I think this applies to China today, of course wouldn't apply much to the UK, because of imports reducing in Russia because of rising commodity costs, agriculture actually expanded during this 1998 crisis, and the labour market in agriculture was filled by internal migrants. And certainly countries like Russia and China tend to fill labour market gaps with internal migrants first rather than international migrants. And again, I think focusing on internal as well as international migration may be important. And a final striking issue, I think, that came out of Russia, the government responded by addressing underlying causes, by looking at the economic policies and not the migration policies. The government's attitude was if we can fix the economic policies, migration will take care of itself, and largely it did. And I think that's something to remember when we think about how to respond to the financial crisis today. What can we say then about the impacts of today's global financial crisis on migration? The first thing to say is it's far too early to say. Migration data lags significantly behind the present time. We don't know much about migration in the last year. There's normally a reporting lag of at least a year. Equally, we don't really know yet the full depth and the full scale of the global financial crisis. Is it going to tip the world into a recession? Is it going to be a short-term blip? We simply don't know enough yet to say with any certainty what the effects of the global financial crisis will be for international migration. What we can do is look at some of the initial indicators that are coming out and look at some of the debates that are preoccupying governments at the moment around the world. And here's a few of them. One thing's clear is that the global financial crisis is overshadowing policymaking in other areas. The Global Forum on Migration and Development met recently in Manila, intending to forge greater links between migration and development, and instead focused on the financial crisis. The European Council met 2 weeks ago in Brussels, intending to forge greater links and to try to combat irregular migration, instead focused quite specifically on the financial crisis. I was very struck, I lived in the USA before coming back to Geneva. I was very struck how migration wasn't an issue in the US election campaigns, and it seems very clear now that the financial crisis will delay any form of migration policy on the part of Obama and Biden. So, again, an overshadowing or a diversion of attention from migration. The Swedes are planning to introduce a new immigration system this year. There are all sorts of indications that won't happen now because of a delay because of the financial crisis. And it may well be that the UK's efforts to fully implement its new system will be delayed too. Now, that matters because, frankly, the migration system in the world today doesn't really work. And if we're going to find more excuses to put it off and to delay finding policies to try to fix it, then I think that's a concern. There's limited evidence, and it's very limited, again because of the time lag, that remittances in certain parts of the world may be reducing. As migrants are losing jobs or their wages are getting cut, they may have less money to send home. Against that, there's indications from other parts of the world that actually remittances are increasing, and that may well be because migrants are being scared of being laid off, scared of reducing wages, and so they're beginning to rest back at home in preparation for having to go back home. So mixed messages on remittances, but there seems to be some impact on remittances as you'd expect from the global financial crisis. Several countries in the world, Australia is one, Canada is another, tend to issue quotas each year for the number of migrants they want to enter the country. And it's a pretty fixed quota, 70,000 people this year we want working in various sectors. Both those countries, Australia and Canada, are now considering reducing their quotas for migration this year and next year as a direct result of concerns about the global financial crisis. And I think that's a mistake, and I think we'll come back to this, and Philly hinted at this, and I think it's something worth discussing. We know that some migrants are voting with their feet effectively. We've heard about the Poles responding to disparities in labour markets, leaving the UK, going back to Poland where there might be more chance of working and saving, and so on and so forth. There are very real concerns amongst human rights activists that if there's a period of recession and retrenchment, the first people to suffer will be migrant workers. The first people will look to lay off will be migrant workers. The Asian experience suggests that's not the case. And I suspect civil society is overstating the case. And I suspect actually, because they're willing to work in dirty, dangerous and difficult jobs, and because they're willing to work at low wages, the migrant workers may well survive and it'll be local workers who get laid off. But again, we may come back to that debate.
Khalid, sorry, you'll have to conclude.
I shall. One more point on this slide, then I shall conclude. There is a concern that some states will respond with further restrictions on migration as a result of the global financial crisis. My final slide, what might be the implications of this for the UK? I'm sure there will be growing pressures on migration from poor countries, but I'm not sure that that will affect the UK. There's a great debate about to what extent migration from poor countries affects which countries in the north, and I don't think it'll affect the UK in any particular significant way. We'll certainly see a greater flux in the movement of EU workers, including UK workers, responding to disparities across Europe and responding to openings and closings of labour market opportunities. I think there'll be a heightened competition for the limited global pool of skills. People need to find skilled people to get them out of this mess. There's a small number of them around the world, and countries are competing to get those skills. I wouldn't be surprised to see a new brain drain of UK professionals. If research money runs out, if universities stop employing people, if science and industry and technology don't develop in the UK because of the recession, people may well respond by moving, for example, to the USA and Canada. It happened in the 1970s, and it may well happen again. And my final point, I would expect a modest increase in the number of irregular migrants. People will want to leave poor countries. They won't be able to come legally to countries like the UK, and so they'll come illegally. And also, if people are laid off in this country, if migrant workers are the first to be laid off, I suspect they'll stay here illegally rather than go home voluntarily.